The maintenance bay of Orbital Station Nexus 7 hummed with the familiar symphony of hydraulic pistons and welding torches. Sarah Chun wiped grease from her hands with a worn cloth, her dark hair escaping from beneath her safety helmet as she surveyed the massive cargo hauler she'd just finished repairing. The ship's alien owner, a towering Catharian with crystalline skin, nodded approvingly before transferring credits to her account without a word. Another satisfied customer in what had become the most diverse repair shop in known space. The station itself was a marvel of interspecies cooperation, a rotating cylinder 3 kilometers long that housed nearly 500,000 beings from dozens of different worlds. Trade flowed through its docking bays like blood through arteries, bringing together species that had never dreamed of each other's existence just 50 years ago. Sarah had grown up here, the daughter of 2 engineers who'd helped build this place when humanity first joined the Galactic Trade Consortium. She was reaching for her next work order when the bay's communication panel chimed with an urgent priority signal. The holographic display flickered to life, showing the stern face of Commander Vex, the station's security chief. His blue-scaled features were tense, with an emotion Sarah had rarely seen from the normally composed Zilani officer. Mechanic Chun, report to diplomatic section immediately. You have a priority assignment. Sarah blinked in confusion. Sir, I think there's been a mistake. I'm not diplomatic personnel. I fix ships and machinery. No mistake. The request specifically asked for you by name and occupation. A diplomatic transport arrived an hour ago, carrying Ambassador Keth Moore of the Hegemony Council. He's refusing all contact except with a human mechanic. You're the only one on the station. The name hit Sarah like a cold wave. Even someone like her, who cared more about fusion reactors than politics, knew that name. Ambassador Keth Moore had been the Hegemony's chief negotiator for over 3 centuries. He'd brokered peace treaties that ended wars spanning entire star systems and trade agreements that connected civilizations across the galaxy. His sudden appearance here, on a mid-tier trading station, was like finding a legendary artifact in a junk shop. But why would he want to see me? Sarah asked, her mind racing. I've never even met a Hegemony official before. Commander Vex's expression darkened. That's what we need to find out. His transport captain mentioned something about old debts and forgotten promises. The ambassador appears to be in poor health, and his mental state is questionable. The council representatives are extremely concerned. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. The Hegemony Council represented over 200 species across 15 sectors of the galaxy. Their displeasure could mean everything from trade sanctions to military intervention. Whatever was happening, it was far above her pay grade. I'll be there in 10 minutes, she said, already stripping off her work coveralls to reveal the clean jumpsuit underneath. The journey from the industrial sections to the diplomatic quarter took her through the station's main concourse, a vast atrium filled with the controlled chaos of interspecies commerce. She passed Thraxian merchants haggling over rare minerals, their insectoid limbs clicking as they gestured. A group of ethereal whisper folk drifted past like living smoke, their forms barely visible in the artificial atmosphere they carried around themselves. The air thrummed with a dozen different languages and the subtle harmonics of universal translators working overtime. But today the usual bustle felt different. Sarah noticed more security personnel than normal, their weapons prominently displayed. Conversations seemed more hushed, and she caught several beings looking toward the diplomatic section with expressions she couldn't quite read. News traveled fast in a closed environment like the station, and word of the ambassador's strange request was already spreading. The diplomatic quarter was a world apart from the rest of the station. Here, corridors were wider, the lighting softer, and the air carried the faint scent of ozone from high-end atmospheric processors. Security checkpoints appeared every 50 meters, each one more sophisticated than the last. Sarah submitted to 3 different scans, provided biometric data, and answered questions from guards representing species she couldn't even identify. Finally, she stood before the entrance to Diplomatic Suite 7, the most secure facility on the station. Through the reinforced transparent aluminum, she could see a chamber designed to accommodate the environmental needs of dozens of species simultaneously. The walls shifted color and texture in response to the occupants' preferences, while the atmosphere itself was divided into carefully controlled zones. Commander Vex appeared beside her, having arrived through a separate corridor. Before you go in, there are things you need to know. Ambassador Kethmore is over 400 years old, ancient even by hegemony standards. He's been missing from the Council for 6 months. When his transport appeared on our sensors, it was broadcasting outdated identification codes and following flight patterns that haven't been used in decades. Sarah studied the commander's face. You think he's lost his mind? I think he's dangerous in ways we don't understand. His species, the Eternal Watchers, possess mental capabilities that can influence other beings' thoughts and emotions. A damaged mind with that kind of power. He left the sentence hanging. Through the transparent wall, Sarah could see movement in the chamber center. A figure sat in what appeared to be a meditation pose, surrounded by floating holographic displays showing star charts, treaty documents, and images of worlds she'd never seen. Even at a distance, there was something unsettling about the way the figure held itself, as if every movement required tremendous effort. What exactly am I supposed to do in there? Sarah asked. Listen, learn what he wants. Try to determine if he's genuinely seeking help or if this is some kind of elaborate deception. Commander Vex paused, his scaled features softening slightly. And try to stay alive. His last conversation with council representatives ended with 3 of them requiring medical treatment for what the doctors described as psychic feedback. The airlock cycled open with a soft hiss. Sarah stepped inside, feeling the atmosphere adjust itself to her human physiology. The chamber was larger than it had appeared from outside, its walls stretching up into shadows that seemed to move independently of the lighting. The floating displays cast shifting patterns of light and color that made depth perception difficult. Ambassador Kethmore sat in the center of it, all like a statue carved from living shadow. His species was humanoid in basic structure, but stretched and elongated in ways that suggested a fundamental difference in evolutionary development. His skin appeared to be made of a dark, crystalline material that reflected light in complex patterns. Most unsettling were his eyes, which seemed to contain swirling galaxies of silver light. When he spoke, his voice resonated not just through the air, but somehow directly into Sarah's mind, carrying with it the weight of centuries. You are the mechanic who repairs what others consider irreparably broken. It wasn't a question. Sarah found herself nodding before she'd consciously decided to respond. There was something about his presence that made deception feel impossible, as if her thoughts were written in the air around her for him to read. I fix machines, yes. Ships mostly. Sometimes station systems. Her voice sounded small in the vast chamber. The ambassador's head tilted slightly, a movement that somehow conveyed both ancient wisdom and crushing weariness. And what of things that are not machines? What of treaties that have been shattered? What of trust that has been broken? What of promises made by those who are now dust between the stars? Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the chamber's temperature. I don't understand what you're asking me. For a long moment, the ambassador was silent. The holographic displays around him shifted, showing images that made Sarah's breath catch. She saw her grandfather, a man who had died when she was 5 years old, standing in what appeared to be this very chamber. But the walls were different, newer somehow, and the equipment was of a design she didn't recognize. Your grandfather was Thomas Chun, chief engineer of the human delegation during the first contact protocols. Sarah stared at the image floating before her. Her grandfather looked impossibly young, perhaps 30 years old, wearing a uniform she'd never seen before. He was shaking hands with a figure she now recognized as a much younger Ambassador Kethmore. That's impossible. Grandfather died in an industrial accident on Luna Base. He never left the solar system. The ambassador's galaxy-filled eyes seemed to pierce straight through her. What you were told and what actually occurred are not the same thing. Your grandfather was instrumental in establishing the frameworks that allowed humanity to join the galactic community. But the price of that membership required sacrifices that few understood and fewer still were willing to make. The holographic display shifted again, showing documents covered in symbols Sarah couldn't read alongside others in clear human script. She caught fragments of text that made her heart race. Technological limitations acceptable, memory modification protocols approved, official history revision complete. He made a promise. The ambassador continued, his mental voice carrying undertones of something that might have been sadness. A promise that if the deception ever threatened the stability of human galaxy relations, his family line would be called upon to help restore the truth. You, Sarah Chun, are the fulfillment of that promise. Sarah's legs felt weak. She sank into a chair that materialized behind her, as if the room itself was responding to her needs. What kind of promise? What deception? The kind that kept your species from destroying itself and others in its eagerness to claim its place among the stars. The kind that prevented wars that would have consumed entire sectors. But also the kind that, if exposed carelessly, could undo everything your grandfather worked to achieve. The ambassador stood, his elongated form unfolding like a dark flower. As he moved, the holographic displays swirled around him, creating a three-dimensional map of local space with hundreds of pulsing markers indicating star systems, trade routes, and political boundaries. 6 months ago, I discovered evidence that the carefully constructed history of human integration is beginning to unravel. There are those who would use this knowledge to destabilize the current balance of power. They seek to expose truths that most beings are not prepared to understand. Sarah found her voice again, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. What truths? The galaxy in the ambassador's eyes seemed to spin faster. That humanity's rapid advancement was not entirely natural. That the technologies that allowed your species to achieve faster-than-light travel in mere decades rather than centuries came from sources that officially do not exist. That the price of this advancement included the systematic modification of human historical records and the memories of those who might have questioned the timeline. The chamber around them seemed to pulse with energy, as if the station itself was holding its breath. Sarah felt the weight of impossible revelations pressing down on her like the gravity of a black hole. But why tell me this? Why not the council? Why not the proper authorities? Ambassador Keth Moore moved closer, and Sarah could feel the mental pressure of his presence like a storm front approaching. Because the proper authorities include those who perpetuated the deception and those who would exploit its revelation. Because the council itself was built upon the frameworks your grandfather helped establish, and many of its members have their own secrets they would kill to protect. He gestured to the holographic displays, which now showed what appeared to be surveillance footage of various council members in heated discussions. Sarah couldn't understand their words, but their body language spoke of fear and desperation. Help me honor a promise made before you were born to a man who sacrificed everything so that his granddaughter might one day have the chance to choose her species' future. Around them, the holographic displays began to coalesce into a single image, a massive structure floating in the void between stars. It was clearly artificial, its design incorporating elements from dozens of different species' architectural styles. At its center was a chamber that looked remarkably similar to where Sarah now sat. This is where it all began, the ambassador said. The Confluence, a research station built by a coalition of species working in absolute secrecy. Your grandfather spent 3 years there, helping to develop the technologies and protocols that would shape first contact between humanity and the galaxy. The station still exists, hidden in a pocket of altered space-time that makes it invisible to conventional sensors. Sarah stared at the image, feeling as if she were looking at the answer to questions she'd never known she should ask. And you want me to go there? I want you to understand what your grandfather understood, and to make the choice he was never allowed to make. The confluence contains records of everything that was done to integrate humanity into galactic society. It also contains the tools necessary to reverse those processes, should that be deemed necessary. The weight of implication hit her like a physical blow. You're talking about potentially undoing 50 years of human history. I'm talking about giving humanity the choice that was taken from it. The choice between comfortable ignorance and difficult truth, between security purchased through deception and freedom earned through knowledge. Sarah stood up, pacing to the edge of the chamber where the walls seemed to bend perception in impossible ways. Through the transparent aluminum, she could see Commander Vex and a growing crowd of officials watching anxiously. Their faces reflected the same confusion and concern she felt magnifying within herself. "This is insane," she said finally. "I'm a mechanic. I fix fusion reactors and hyperdrives. I'm not qualified to make decisions that could affect billions of people." And yet, the ambassador's mental voice carried a note of something that might have been amusement. "When a fusion reactor fails, do you not sometimes need to understand the entire ship's power grid to fix it properly? When a hyperdrive malfunctions, do you not sometimes need to examine the navigation systems, the structural integrity, even the crew's piloting habits?" Sarah turned back to face him, seeing her reflection multiplied infinitely in his crystalline skin. "That's different. Those are machines. Are they? Or are they simply systems of interconnected parts, each affecting the others, all requiring balance and understanding to function properly? What is galactic civilization but a vast machine composed of countless species, each playing their role, all dependent on the others for the whole to continue functioning?" The holographic displays around them shifted again, showing shipping lanes filled with vessels from dozens of species, space stations where beings worked together despite vast biological and cultural differences, and planets where children of different species played together in ways that would have been impossible just generations ago. Your grandfather understood this. He saw that the machine of civilization was broken. That first contact between species too often led to misunderstanding, conflict, and tragedy. He helped develop tools to repair that machine, to create connections where none had existed before. But, like any mechanic, he knew that some repairs require techniques that the machine's users might not approve of if they understood them fully. Sarah felt herself being drawn deeper into the ambassador's perspective despite her resistance. And now the repairs are failing? Now the concealment of those repairs has become a weakness that others seek to exploit. There are factions within the council who know fragments of the truth and would use them to seize power. There are species who have begun to suspect that their own integration involves similar deceptions and demand answers. And there are those who believe that humanity's rapid advancement represents a threat that must be contained or eliminated. The ambassador stood again, and this time Sarah felt the full weight of his mental presence, not threatening, but overwhelming in its intensity. Images flashed through her mind faster than she could process them. Space battles between fleets of ships she didn't recognize, planets burning under orbital bombardment, refugee ships fleeing through hyperspace while pursued by vessels of unknown design. "This is what failure looks like," he said. "This is what happens when the careful balance your grandfather helped create finally collapses. Not just the end of human participation in galactic society, but the potential destruction of the framework that has kept hundreds of species from destroying each other for half a century." Sarah sank back in her chair, feeling utterly overwhelmed. "Why don't you just fix it yourself? You've been doing this for centuries. Surely you have more experience with these kinds of problems than I do." The ambassador's form seemed to flicker, and for a moment Sarah saw through the imposing exterior to something that looked fragile and ancient beyond measure. "Because I am dying. My species' mental abilities come with a price that compounds over time. Each memory I preserve, each mind I touch, each thought I maintain across the centuries creates neural pathways that eventually become too complex for biological matter to sustain." He gestured to the floating displays around them, And Sarah realized that they weren't just showing information. They were extensions of his mind, external storage for memories and knowledge that his brain could no longer contain. I have perhaps days before the degradation reaches a critical point. After that, everything I know, everything I have seen and experienced across 4 centuries of diplomatic service will be lost. Unless what? Unless it can be transferred to someone with the genetic markers necessary to safely receive and process it. Someone whose family line was specifically prepared for this possibility. Someone who combines the technical knowledge necessary to understand what was done with the moral framework necessary to decide what should be done next. Sarah felt the pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. You want to transfer your memories to me. I want to honor your grandfather's promise by giving his descendant the choice he was denied. Accept this knowledge and the responsibility that comes with it, or walk away and let events follow their natural course. But understand that walking away means accepting the likely destruction of everything humanity has achieved among the stars. The chamber fell silent except for the subtle hum of life support systems. Sarah stared at the ambassador, trying to process the magnitude of what she was being offered. Around them, the holographic displays showed scenes from across the galaxy. Humans working alongside aliens in ways that would have seemed like fantasy just a few generations ago. Children of different species learning together, technologies that had revolutionized life for billions of beings. All of it potentially built on lies. All of it potentially doomed to collapse. And somehow, the weight of deciding its fate was being placed on her shoulders. Sarah took a deep breath, tasting the carefully controlled atmosphere of the diplomatic chamber. In a few hours, she had gone from a simple mechanic worried about fusion reactor maintenance to someone being asked to determine the future of human civilization. It felt surreal, like a dream that had spiraled completely out of control. But as she looked at the ancient ambassador, seeing the genuine desperation behind his impossible composure, she began to understand that this was no dream. This was the most important repair job of her life, and the machine she was being asked to fix was civilization itself. The decision to leave the station felt both inevitable and impossible. Sarah stood in her quarters, staring at the small duffel bag that contained everything she considered essential for a journey she couldn't fully comprehend. 3 days had passed since her first meeting with Ambassador Kethmore, and each hour brought new complications that made the situation increasingly difficult to ignore. The station's communication networks buzzed with encrypted transmissions between council representatives and their home governments. Ships arrived and departed with unusual frequency, and Sarah noticed that several docking bays had been sealed off for what officials claimed were routine maintenance procedures. But maintenance crews didn't typically carry military-grade energy weapons, and routine procedures didn't require the level of electronic countermeasures she'd observed being installed. Commander Vex had briefed her on the political situation with characteristic bluntness. 3 council species have recalled their ambassadors in the last 48 hours. The Crystalline Collective is demanding a formal investigation into what they're calling historical irregularities in human integration records. And the Thraxian Trade Federation has suspended all contracts with human-controlled corporations pending what they describe as clarification of species capability assessments. Sarah had listened to the briefing while mechanically checking the ambassador's transport vessel, a sleek craft that incorporated technologies she'd never seen before. Its power systems operated on principles that seemed to bend physical laws, and its navigation computer contained star charts showing regions of space that officially didn't exist on any map she'd ever studied. The council is fracturing, Vex had continued. Whatever the ambassador knows, whatever he shared with you, it's already having effects that reach far beyond this station. We've intercepted communications suggesting that at least 6 species are preparing military responses to what they perceive as potential human deception or threat. Now, as Sarah sealed her bag and prepared to board the ambassador's transport, she tried not to think about the fact that her decision might be contributing to the very crisis she was supposed to help resolve. The weight of galactic politics pressed down on her like the gravity well of a neutron star, and she found herself questioning whether a simple mechanic really had any business attempting to navigate such treacherous waters. The transport's interior was a marvel of adaptive architecture. Surfaces shifted and reconfigured themselves based on the occupants' needs, while the atmosphere maintained perfect environmental conditions for both human and Eternal Watcher physiology. Ambassador Keth Moore sat in what appeared to be a meditation alcove, surrounded by the same type of floating holographic displays she'd seen in the diplomatic chamber. But now those displays showed something different. Real-time feeds from across the galaxy showing the growing crisis his revelations had sparked. Second thoughts? He asked as Sarah settled into a chair that molded itself to her body with unsettling precision. About 1,000 of them, she admitted. But I keep coming back to something you said about fixing machines. Sometimes you have to tear down what's broken before you can build something that works. The ambassador's crystalline features shifted in what she'd learned to recognize as his equivalent of a smile. Your grandfather said something remarkably similar when we first met. He was examining the prototype universal translator that would eventually make interspecies communication possible, and he told me that the most elegant solutions often require completely reimagining the problem. The transport's engines hummed to life with a sound unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Instead of the familiar roar of plasma drives or the high-pitched whine of gravitic systems, this vessel seemed to slip between normal space and something else entirely. Through the viewports, stars began to stream past in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Where exactly are we going? Sarah asked, trying to distract herself from the nauseating sensation of traveling through whatever medium this ship used for faster-than-light travel. To see the truth, the ambassador replied. The Confluence Station exists in a pocket of artificially altered space-time, anchored to a point roughly 7 light-years from here, but existing partially outside normal dimensional boundaries. It's one of 12 such facilities constructed by the coalition of seeking species, though the others have been decommissioned or destroyed. The holographic displays around them shifted to show a complex three-dimensional diagram of local space. Sarah could see normal stars and planets marked in familiar notation, but overlaying them was another layer of symbols and connecting lines that suggested a hidden architecture underlying the visible galaxy. The coalition was formed during what we now call the Integration Crisis, a period roughly 80 years ago when rapid expansion of interstellar travel brought dozens of species into contact with each other for the first time. The results were catastrophic. Entire civilizations destroyed through misunderstanding. Wars fought over resources that both sides were too alien to properly share. Cultural contamination that led to the collapse of societies that had existed for millennia. Sarah studied the diagram, beginning to see patterns in the hidden layer that corresponded to trade routes, diplomatic installations, and centers of political power throughout human space. So the coalition decided to find a way to make integration more controlled. More successful, the ambassador corrected. The technologies developed at the Confluence Stations weren't designed to control or manipulate, but to create genuine understanding between species that had evolved to think and communicate in fundamentally incompatible ways. Universal translation protocols that could convey not just words but emotional and cultural context. Neural interface systems that allowed direct, mind-to-mind communication without the psychological contamination that normally results. Memory editing techniques that could help beings process traumatic first-contact experiences. The transport shuddered slightly as it transitioned back into normal space. Through the viewports, Sarah could see a region of space that looked subtly wrong, as if someone had taken a photograph and then deliberately blurred certain sections. At the center of the distortion, something vast and complex slowly resolved into visibility. The Confluence Station was larger than most cities Sarah had seen, a sprawling collection of interconnected modules and research facilities that seemed to have grown organically over time, rather than being planned by any single intelligence. Different sections showed architectural influences from dozens of species, creating a hodgepodge structure that somehow managed to appear both chaotic and purposeful. "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered, then immediately felt foolish for the emotional response. "Your grandfather said the same thing when he first saw it. He also said it looked like the kind of place where gods would go to learn about mortals." The ambassador's mental voice carried traces of ancient fondness mixed with current sorrow. Perhaps he was more right than he knew. As their transport approached the station's docking facilities, Sarah could see other ships already secured to the massive structure. Most were of designs she didn't recognize, clearly representing species that weren't part of the current galactic community. But a few looked disturbingly familiar, bearing the distinctive hull markings of council vessels. "We're not the only ones who've come here recently," she observed. The ambassador's crystalline skin darkened perceptibly. "No, word of my departure from council space has reached certain interested parties. They understand as well as I do that the confluence contains information that could either validate or destroy the current political order. Some are here to learn the truth. Others are here to ensure that certain truths remain buried." The docking process was handled by automated systems that seemed to operate on principles Sarah couldn't begin to understand. One moment, they were approaching the station's hull, and the next they were inside a vast hangar bay filled with vessels representing dozens of different technological approaches to space travel. The air itself seemed to shimmer with energy fields designed to maintain atmospheric integrity for radically different life forms. As they disembarked, Sarah found herself surrounded by beings she'd never imagined could exist. A creature that looked like living crystal communicated through patterns of colored light that danced across its surfaces. Something that might have been a sentient plant swayed gently in a mobile atmosphere dome, its roots extending into what appeared to be a portable ecosystem. Most disturbing was a being that seemed to exist partially in normal space and partially somewhere else entirely, flickering in and out of visibility as it moved. "Representatives of the original coalition species," the ambassador explained as they walked through the hangar. "The confluence has been their home for nearly a century, though few of them have any contact with the outside galaxy anymore. They've dedicated their lives to understanding the fundamental nature of consciousness and communication between radically different forms of intelligence." They entered a transportation tube that carried them through the station's interior at tremendous speed. Through the transparent walls, Sarah caught glimpses of laboratories containing equipment that defied rational analysis, living quarters adapted for beings whose environmental needs would have been impossible to meet with conventional technology, and vast chambers where different species appeared to be engaged in activities that might have been research, artistic expression, or forms of communication entirely beyond human comprehension. This place operates outside the normal laws of physics, she realized. Not outside them, but according to principles that most species haven't discovered yet. The Coalition's research into consciousness and communication led them to understand that the universe itself is far more malleable than most civilizations believe. Reality, they learned, is as much about perception and intent as it is about physical laws. The transportation tube deposited them in a section of the station that felt immediately familiar to Sarah despite being built with clearly non-human design principles. The corridors had the right proportions for human movement. The lighting was tuned to wavelengths that human eyes found comfortable, and the air carried scents that reminded her of Earth forests she'd never personally seen but somehow recognized at a genetic level. The human quarters, the ambassador explained, built according to specifications your grandfather provided during his time here. He understood that for humans to work effectively with coalition scientists, they would need an environment that felt psychologically safe and familiar. They passed through several security checkpoints, each one more sophisticated than anything Sarah had seen even on military installations. But these weren't designed to keep intruders out, she realized. They were designed to ensure that beings entering the deeper sections of the station were mentally and emotionally prepared for what they would encounter. Finally, They reached a chamber that took Sarah's breath away. It was vast beyond easy measurement, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. The walls were covered with what appeared to be a three-dimensional map of the galaxy, but rendered with a level of detail that showed not just stars and planets, but the flow of trade, communication, cultural influence, and political power between countless civilizations. At the center of the chamber stood a structure that looked like a cross between a library and a temple. Crystalline matrices stored data in formats that created visible patterns of light and color, while organic components seemed to process and analyze information in ways that resembled biological thought processes. The entire structure hummed with an energy that Sarah could feel in her bones. The archive, the ambassador said. Every decision made by the coalition, every modification performed on integrating species, every consequence both intended and unintended is recorded here, including the complete records of humanity's integration process. As they approached the archive, Sarah became aware that they weren't alone in the chamber. Figures moved through the data streams with practiced efficiency, being she recognized as representatives of various council species despite the specialized equipment they wore. Their presence here felt ominous, like walking into a library and finding armed guards reading through the books. Council investigators, the ambassador confirmed her suspicions. They arrived yesterday, claiming authority to examine the records under emergency powers granted by the Hegemony Council. They're looking for evidence to support their theory that humanity's integration involved illegal modifications that violate several fundamental treaties. Sarah felt her stomach clench. And did it? That, said a new voice, is exactly what we intend to determine. Sarah turned to see a figure approaching through the data streams, and her blood ran cold. The being was humanoid, but clearly artificial, its metallic skin bearing the distinctive markings of the synthetic collective. Its optical sensors focused on her with an intensity that made her feel like a specimen under examination. Investigator Prime Zeta 7, the artificial being, introduced itself. I am here to conduct an impartial examination of the records regarding species designation, human, and their accelerated integration into galactic civilization. Your presence here is noted and will be included in my report to the Council. The ambassador stepped forward, his mental presence suddenly feeling like a storm front. Investigator, Dr. Chun is here at my invitation and under diplomatic protection. She has legitimate interests in these proceedings. Illegitimate interests, more accurately. Investigator Prime Zeta 7 replied, its vocal modulator producing harmonies that somehow conveyed disdain despite being mechanically generated. As the descendant of Thomas Chun, primary human consultant during the integration process, she represents a conflict of interest that could compromise the integrity of this investigation. Sarah found her voice despite the intimidating presence of the synthetic being. What exactly are you investigating? The investigator's optical sensors whirred as they adjusted focus. Allegations that humanity's integration process involved systematic violations of the consciousness accords, specifically the unauthorized modification of human memory engrams, and the suppression of historical records that would have prevented your species from providing informed consent to integration procedures. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Everything the ambassador had suggested was apparently true, and now she was standing in the middle of what amounted to an interstellar criminal investigation with herself and her grandfather as key figures. Furthermore, the investigator continued, preliminary examination of the records suggests that these modifications may have been more extensive than initially believed. We have discovered evidence of alterations to human genetic markers, modifications to your species' basic psychological profiles, and the introduction of technological capabilities that your civilization could not have developed independently. Sarah looked at the ambassador, seeing her own growing horror reflected in his ancient features. How extensive? It was the investigator who answered. Based on current analysis, Approximately 37% of human technological advancement since first contact appears to have been artificially accelerated through direct knowledge transfer from coalition sources. Additionally, nearly 60% of your species' population shows markers indicating some level of memory modification, primarily focused on the suppression of cognitive dissonance related to the rapid pace of social and technological change. The implications staggered Sarah. If the investigators' findings were accurate, then humanity, as she knew it, was essentially an artificial construction. The proud history of human achievement among the stars was built on a foundation of lies and manipulations that had altered her species at a fundamental level. The most disturbing finding, the investigator continued, is evidence that these modifications are still active. The systems put in place during humanity's integration continue to operate, subtly influencing human behavior and perception to maintain social stability and prevent the kind of cultural breakdown that historically accompanies rapid technological advancement. Sarah sank into a chair that materialized from the archive's adaptive infrastructure, feeling as if the deck was falling away beneath her. You're saying we're not even really human anymore. I'm saying that the question of what constitutes authentic humanity has become extremely complex. Your species has been guided, shaped, and modified to such an extent that determining where natural human development ends and artificial intervention begins may be impossible. The ambassador moved closer to Sarah, his mental presence offering what comfort it could. This is why I needed you to see these records personally. The choice I spoke of is more fundamental than I initially indicated. It's not just about revealing the truth to humanity. It's about deciding whether humanity, as it exists now, has the right to continue existing, or whether the modifications should be reversed regardless of the consequences. Sarah looked up at him, feeling a despair deeper than anything she'd experienced before. What would happen if the modifications were reversed? According to our models, the investigator replied with mechanical precision, reversal of the psychological modifications would likely result in massive social breakdown as humans suddenly became aware of the artificial nature of their recent development. Reversal of the technological modifications would eliminate approximately 40% of your species' current capabilities, effectively reducing your civilization to pre-contact levels. And reversal of the genetic modifications could have unpredictable effects on human reproduction and development. In other words, the ambassador added grimly, attempting to restore authentic humanity would likely destroy the humanity that currently exists. Sarah buried her head in her hands, trying to process the magnitude of what she was being told. Every choice seemed to lead to catastrophe. Revealing the truth would likely destroy human civilization. Keeping it secret meant living with the knowledge that her entire species existed in a carefully constructed illusion. And the growing political crisis meant that doing nothing was no longer an option. There has to be another way, she said finally. There has to be some solution that doesn't involve choosing between different kinds of destruction. The investigator's optical sensors focused on her again. Perhaps, but finding such a solution would require capabilities that neither the Council nor the Coalition currently possesses. It would require someone who could understand both the technical aspects of the modifications and their broader implications for human society. Someone who could navigate the political complexities while maintaining focus on the ultimate goal of preserving both truth and stability. Sarah realized that once again, despite her protests and qualifications, the weight of impossible responsibility was settling on her shoulders. But this time she was beginning to understand why. The ambassador was right about one thing. Sometimes the most complex problems required the simplest solutions. And sometimes the person best equipped to fix a broken machine was the one who understood how machines worked, regardless of whether they understood the politics surrounding that machine. She stood up, feeling a resolve she didn't know she possessed crystallizing in her chest. Show me everything. Show me exactly what was done, how it was done, and what tools were used to do it. If I'm going to fix this mess, I need to understand every component of the system. The ambassador's crystalline features brightened perceptibly. That, Dr. Chun, is exactly what your grandfather would have said. The deeper levels of the archive contained technologies that challenged Sarah's understanding of what was possible. She followed the ambassador through corridors lined with crystalline matrices that pulsed with patterns of light too complex for human eyes to fully process. Each step took them further from anything resembling normal space, and deeper into regions where the fundamental laws of physics seemed to operate according to different principles. The consciousness manipulation technologies developed here represent the culmination of research spanning multiple civilizations across thousands of years, the ambassador explained as they walked. What was done to humanity was not unique. Similar processes were used to integrate 17 other species into galactic civilization, though none required modifications as extensive as those applied to your people. They entered a laboratory chamber where the walls themselves seemed to be alive, shifting and flowing in response to the thoughts and emotions of the occupants. At the center of the room stood what appeared to be a chair surrounded by an intricate array of devices that combined organic components with crystalline structures and metallic frameworks that defied easy categorization. The integration throne, the ambassador said. Your grandfather spent 47 days connected to this apparatus, while coalition scientists mapped every aspect of human consciousness. They documented how humans process information, form memories, experience emotions, and make decisions. That data became the foundation for all subsequent modifications. Sarah approached the throne cautiously, feeling an inexplicable sense of familiarity as she drew near. The organic components seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, while the crystalline elements began to glow with a soft light that somehow reminded her of summer afternoons she'd never experienced. He volunteered for this. He insisted upon it. Your grandfather understood that successful integration required the coalition to understand humanity at the most fundamental level possible. But he also insisted on safeguards that would protect human autonomy and preserve what he called the essential human spirit. Investigator Prime, Zeta-7, materialized from the flowing walls like a ghost emerging from smoke. Those safeguards proved insufficient. Our analysis indicates that the modifications introduced systematic changes to human psychology that may have altered your species' developmental trajectory in ways Thomas Chun could not have anticipated. Seraph studied the throne, trying to imagine her grandfather sitting here, while alien scientists peered into the deepest recesses of human consciousness. What kind of changes? Increased social cooperation, reduced xenophobic responses, enhanced ability to process complex information, and improved emotional regulation under stress, the investigator listed with mechanical precision. All beneficial modifications from one perspective, but they represent fundamental alterations to human nature that may have eliminated aspects of your species' character that were considered essential to your identity. The ambassador's mental presence took on overtones of frustration. The modifications were designed to help humans adapt to a galactic environment that would have otherwise overwhelmed them. Without those changes, first contact would likely have resulted in psychological breakdown for millions of humans and potentially violent conflicts that could have devastated multiple star systems. Sarah reached out to touch one of the throne's crystalline components, and immediately felt a jolt of connection that sent images flooding through her mind. She saw her grandfather sitting in this very chair, his young face set with determination as coalition scientists prepared their equipment. She felt his emotions as if they were her own, fear mixed with excitement, uncertainty balanced by absolute conviction that what he was doing was necessary for humanity's survival. But underneath those surface emotions, she sensed something else, a deep sadness that came from understanding exactly what he was sacrificing. Her grandfather had known that the modifications would fundamentally change what it meant to be human. He had chosen to accept that cost because the alternative was worse. He left something here, she whispered, the knowledge coming to her through the connection with the throne. some kind of message or protocol that was supposed to activate if the modifications ever became a problem. The investigators' optical sensors whirred as they focused on her with increased intensity. Explain. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the connection deepen. The crystalline components of the throne were more than just recording devices. They were quantum storage matrices capable of preserving not just information, but the actual patterns of consciousness itself. And buried deep within their structure, she could sense a presence that felt achingly familiar. He encoded a copy of his unmodified consciousness into the throne's matrix, a backup of what humanity was before the integration process began. He intended it to serve as a reference point if anyone ever needed to understand the difference between original and modified human nature. The ambassador moved closer, his ancient mind reaching out to examine what Sarah was perceiving. Extraordinary. I was present during his time here, but I was not aware of this additional protocol. Your grandfather was far more prescient than any of us realized. Can you access it? The investigator asked. Sarah hesitated. The connection she was feeling with the throne was intensely personal, like touching the soul of someone she'd loved but barely remembered. But it was also potentially the key to understanding everything that had happened to her species. I think so, but I'll need help. The matrix is keyed to respond to specific genetic markers, but the data it contains is too complex for an unmodified human mind to process safely. The ambassador stepped forward without hesitation. I can provide the necessary neural buffering. My species' mental capabilities are specifically adapted for processing alien consciousness patterns. The risks are considerable, the investigator warned. Attempting to interface with an archived consciousness could result in permanent psychological damage or mental contamination that would compromise both your judgment and your sanity. Sarah looked around the chamber, seeing it properly for the first time. This wasn't just a laboratory. It was a shrine to the sacrifice her grandfather had made. Every surface bore traces of the research that had transformed humanity from an isolated species into citizens of the galaxy. But it was also a monument to everything that had been lost in that transformation. We have to try, she said finally. If there's any chance of finding a solution that preserves both truth and stability, it's going to require understanding what we've lost as well as what we've gained. The process of preparing for the consciousness interface took several hours. The ambassador worked with coalition technicians to calibrate the throne systems, while Sarah underwent medical scans designed to ensure her nervous system could handle the strain of direct contact with the archived consciousness. The investigator observed everything with mechanical detachment, recording every detail for its eventual report to the council. As Sarah settled into the throne, feeling the organic components adjust themselves to match her physiology, she tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. The crystalline matrices hummed to life around her, creating patterns of light that seemed to resonate with the rhythm of her thoughts. Remember, the ambassador's mental voice whispered her mind, you are not just accessing data. You are making contact with a living consciousness that has been isolated for over 50 years. Approach with respect and caution. The connection began slowly, like tuning an old radio to pick up a distant signal. At first, Sarah felt nothing but a vague sense of presence, as if someone was standing just outside her field of vision. Then, gradually, that presence began to coalesce into something more substantial. Sarah, the voice that spoke her name, carried all the warmth and affection she remembered from her childhood. But it also carried something else, a weight of knowledge and sorrow that had accumulated over decades of isolation. Grandfather, I knew this day would come. I hoped it wouldn't, but I prepared for the possibility that the modifications might eventually require correction or reversal. The consciousness speaking to her felt absolutely real, more vivid and present than many living people she'd known. Through the connection, Sarah began to perceive the world through her grandfather's unmodified human consciousness. The difference was staggering. Where her own mind processed the alien environment of the confluence with calm acceptance, His consciousness reacted with the appropriate levels of wonder, fear, and confusion that first contact with such radically advanced technology should inspire. "The modifications they made to us," she said, "they're more extensive than anyone realized, aren't they?" "They're comprehensive," he confirmed. "But they were also necessary. Sarah, you need to understand what I saw during the early first contact attempts. Without the psychological modifications, the average human reaction to galactic civilization would have been complete mental breakdown. We're talking about species that exist as living energy, civilizations that span entire star clusters, technologies that operate on principles our brains weren't evolved to comprehend." Through the interface, Sarah experienced fragments of those early contact attempts. She felt the crushing sense of inadequacy that came from realizing humanity's place in a galaxy filled with beings whose capabilities made human achievements seem like children's toys. She experienced the existential terror of confronting the possibility that human consciousness itself might be nothing more than a primitive accident in a universe dominated by intelligences beyond comprehension. But at the same time, her grandfather continued. Those modifications eliminated something precious: the raw creativity that comes from genuine ignorance. The stubborn refusal to accept limitations that drives humans to attempt things that more rational beings would never try. The beautiful insanity that makes humans uniquely suited to solving problems that other species find impossible. That's what we lost. That's what we traded away in exchange for stability and acceptance. And for 50 years, it seemed like a good trade. Humans integrated successfully into galactic civilization. We avoided the wars and catastrophes that destroyed other species during first contact. We found our place among the stars. The consciousness interface deepened, and Sarah found herself experiencing her grandfather's memories of the decision-making process that led to the modifications. She felt his anguish as he weighed the benefits of preserving human nature against the costs of potentially destroying human civilization. She understood the impossible position he'd been placed in, forced to make choices that would affect the entire future of his species. "But now the situation has changed," he continued. "The modifications that prevented human breakdown during initial integration are becoming a liability as humanity matures as a galactic species. Other civilizations are beginning to notice that humans don't react to certain stimuli the way they should. They're starting to suspect that something artificial is influencing human behavior. The investigator says the modifications are still active, that they're still influencing how humans think and feel. They were designed to be self-perpetuating, to continue operating until humanity had fully adapted to galactic civilization. But the parameters I set for that adaptation may have been too conservative. The systems are maintaining psychological constraints that are no longer necessary, and may actually be preventing humans from achieving their full potential as a galactic species." Through the interface, Sarah could perceive the technical specifications of the modification systems. They were elegant in their complexity, subtle alterations to human neurology that operated below the level of conscious awareness. But they were also clearly artificial, foreign elements that had been grafted onto human consciousness like sophisticated prosthetics. Can they be removed safely? Not removed, but they can be modified, adjusted to preserve the beneficial aspects while eliminating the unnecessary constraints. It would require precise recalibration of the psychological modification matrices, something that could only be accomplished by someone who understood both the original human baseline and the current modified state. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. Someone like me, someone who's been exposed to your unmodified consciousness while still possessing the modified neural patterns. Someone who could serve as a bridge between what humanity was and what it has become. Someone who could help design modifications that preserve the essential human spirit while maintaining the practical benefits of galactic integration. The implications were staggering. Sarah realized she was being offered the opportunity to literally reshape human consciousness, to determine what humanity would become as it continued to evolve as a galactic species. It was a responsibility that made her earlier concerns about galactic politics seem trivial by comparison. But there's another problem, her grandfather continued. The current crisis isn't just about the modifications themselves. It's about the precedent they represent. If the Council decides that what was done to humanity constitutes a violation of galactic law, they may demand similar reversals for other species that were integrated using comparable methods. We're talking about potentially destabilizing the consciousness of billions of beings across dozens of civilizations. Sarah felt the weight of galactic civilization pressing down on her like the gravity of a black hole. So, if we fix the human modifications, we might trigger the collapse of the entire galactic integration system. Or we might demonstrate that conscious modification can be done ethically with the full consent and participation of the species being modified. We might show that it's possible to preserve authentic identity while still adapting to galactic civilization. The ambassador's mental presence touched the edge of their connection, adding his own perspective to the conversation. The Council is watching this situation very carefully. How humanity handles the revelation of its own modifications will determine how similar revelations about other species are addressed. You have the opportunity to set a precedent that could preserve galactic civilization or contribute to its destruction. Sarah felt herself fragmenting under the pressure of impossible choices and cosmic responsibility. But as she struggled with the magnitude of what was being asked of her, she became aware of something else flowing through the consciousness interface. Her grandfather's unmodified human consciousness carried with it something that her own modified mind had been lacking: the absolute refusal to accept that any problem was truly unsolvable. There's a third option, she realized. Instead of choosing between preserving the modifications or removing them, we could make the modification process voluntary and reversible. We could give individual humans the choice of whether to maintain their current psychological configuration or return to something closer to the original baseline. Her grandfather's consciousness resonated with approval. That would require developing entirely new technologies, modification systems that could be consciously controlled rather than operating automatically. It would be the most complex consciousness engineering project ever attempted. But it would also demonstrate that species can maintain their autonomy while still adapting to galactic civilization, the ambassador added. It could serve as a model for other species facing similar choices. Sarah felt a spark of the same creativity and determination that had driven her grandfather to volunteer for the original integration process. For the first time since learning about the modifications, she could see a path forward that didn't require sacrificing either truth or stability. "We're going to need help," she said. "This isn't something any one person or species can accomplish alone. We need the coalition scientists, the council investigators, and representatives from every species that's been through similar integration processes. The political obstacles will be enormous," the investigator warned, its mechanical voice cutting through the consciousness interface like a blade. Many species will see voluntary modification as an admission that their current consciousness is artificial. Others will view the technology itself as a threat to their autonomy. "Then, we make it transparent," Sarah replied, her confidence growing as the solution crystallized in her mind. "We develop the technology in full view of the galactic community. We document every step, involve representatives from every interested species, and ensure that the process can be independently verified and audited." Her grandfather's consciousness pulsed with pride and approval. "You're thinking like a true mechanic. Instead of hiding the repair, you're showing everyone exactly how the machine works so they can decide for themselves whether they trust it." Sarah opened her eyes and slowly disconnected from the consciousness interface, feeling her grandfather's presence fade, but knowing that the essential insights from their contact would remain with her. Around her, the throne's crystalline matrices continued to glow with soft light, as if they too approved of the direction her thoughts had taken. "It's going to work," she said to the ambassador and the investigator, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. But we're going to need to completely restructure how galactic civilization handles consciousness modification. We're going to need to turn what's been a secret process into a transparent one. The ambassador's ancient features showed the first genuine expression of hope she'd seen from him. Your grandfather would be proud. You found a way to honor both the necessity that drove his original choice and the principles that made that choice so difficult for him. But even as Sarah felt the satisfaction of finding a viable solution, she was aware that the real work was just beginning. Developing the technology would be the easy part compared to navigating the political complexities of implementing it across a galactic civilization built on the foundations of the very secrets they were proposing to reveal. The transformation of the confluence from a secret research facility into the center of galactic consciousness research took place over the course of 6 months that reshaped the political landscape of known space. Sarah found herself at the epicenter of changes she could never have imagined when she was simply fixing fusion reactors on a trading station that now seemed like it existed in another lifetime. The first breakthrough came when she successfully demonstrated the voluntary consciousness modification process on herself. Using technologies derived from her grandfather's original research combined with new development from coalition scientists, she was able to temporarily suppress her own psychological modifications and experience unmodified human consciousness for the first time in her life. The experience was overwhelming. Without the emotional regulation systems that had been installed during humanity's integration, she felt the full impact of galactic civilization like a tsunami of sensation and information. The wonder was magnificent, like seeing color for the first time, but it was accompanied by terror, confusion, and a profound sense of isolation that made her understand why the modifications had been necessary in the first place. But she also felt something else. Creativity and determination that had been dulled by decades of artificial emotional management. Problems that had seemed impossible suddenly appeared to have dozens of potential solutions. Technologies that she'd accepted as beyond human understanding revealed patterns that her unmodified mind could grasp and improve upon. It was as if someone had removed a filter she hadn't known existed, allowing her to see the universe with stunning clarity. The unmodified state is not necessarily superior to the modified one, she reported to the assembled representatives of 47 galactic civilizations who had gathered at the confluence to observe the research. But having conscious control over which state I'm experiencing allows me to choose the mental configuration that's most appropriate for any given situation. The political implications of this breakthrough rippled across the galaxy within hours. Species that had suspected their own integration processes involved unauthorized modifications demanded access to the new technologies. Others, fearful that consciousness modification might be revealed as more widespread than previously believed, attempted to suppress the research through diplomatic pressure. But the momentum was unstoppable. The transparency protocols Sarah had insisted upon meant that every aspect of the research was being broadcast in real time to universities, governments, and research institutions across known space. Any attempt to conceal or distort the findings would be immediately obvious to thousands of independent observers. The breakthrough moment came when Ambassador Kethmore volunteered to undergo the consciousness transfer procedure that would preserve his vast knowledge while allowing him to experience voluntary modification for the first time. The process required technologies that pushed the limits of what was possible, combining quantum consciousness mapping with biological neural integration in ways that had never been attempted. Sarah watched nervously as the ancient Diplomat was connected to an array of devices that represented the culmination of everything they had learned about consciousness modification. The ambassador's 400-year-old mind contained not just memories, but the actual experiences of countless diplomatic encounters, peace negotiations, and cultural exchanges. Preserving that information while allowing him to choose his level of psychological modification was the ultimate test of their new technologies. Transfer initiating, announced Dr. Velsuth, the Coalition's chief consciousness researcher, a being whose crystalline form pulsed with patterns of light that corresponded to complex emotional states. Neural mapping complete. Beginning consciousness preservation protocols. The chamber filled with harmonic frequencies that seemed to resonate with the very structure of space-time itself. Sarah felt her modified human consciousness responding to the harmonics, becoming more aware of the quantum interconnections that linked all conscious beings. Through this heightened awareness, she could perceive the ambassador's mind as it was being carefully preserved and prepared for transfer to a more flexible neural matrix. Remarkable, whispered Investigator Prime, Zeta-7, whose mechanical precision had proven invaluable in documenting the exact nature of the consciousness modification processes. The transfer is maintaining complete fidelity to the original neural patterns while simultaneously creating pathways for voluntary modification. This represents a fundamental advancement in consciousness engineering. The process took 3 hours, during which representatives from across the galaxy watched with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. What they were witnessing was nothing less than the birth of a new form of consciousness, one that combined the wisdom of centuries with the flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining complete autonomy over its own mental configuration. When Ambassador Kethmore opened his eyes, they still contained the swirling galaxies of a species, but now held something additional, a sense of freedom that hadn't been there before. For the first time in his long existence, he had conscious control over his own psychological state. "The fear is gone," he said, his mental voice carrying wonder that touched every conscious being in the chamber. "For 4 centuries, I have carried the accumulated weight of every diplomatic failure, every war that could have been prevented, every species that destroyed itself before we could help them find a better path. That weight has shaped every decision I've made, every risk I've been unwilling to take. Now I can choose whether to carry that burden or set it aside when it's no longer useful." The implications were staggering. A diplomat who could consciously manage his emotional responses while retaining access to the full breadth of his experience could potentially resolve conflicts that had seemed intractable for generations. But, more importantly, the success of the transfer demonstrated that consciousness modification could be ethical, consensual, and reversible. "This changes everything," breathed Dr. Thessarian of the Collective Minds, a hive consciousness species that had been struggling with questions of individual autonomy for millennia. If consciousness can be voluntarily modified while preserving authentic identity, it opens possibilities for cooperation between species that we never dared to imagine. But even as the success of the ambassador's transformation created waves of optimism, Sarah was aware that the real test was yet to come. Developing the technology was only the first step. Implementing it across a galactic civilization that had been built on the assumption that consciousness modification was impossible would require navigating political complexities that made her original concerns about fusion reactor maintenance seem absurdly simple. The first major challenge came from the Purist Coalition, a faction of species that viewed any form of consciousness modification as a fundamental violation of natural law. They argued that beings who underwent voluntary modification were no longer truly themselves, regardless of their consent or the reversibility of the process. "You are proposing the deliberate corruption of consciousness itself," declared Speaker Threnka of the Pure Thought Collective during a heated debate broadcast across the galaxy. "Once a being chooses to modify their mental processes, they can no longer be trusted to make rational decisions about further modifications. This technology represents a path to the complete dissolution of authentic consciousness throughout the galaxy." Sarah found herself thrust into the role of chief advocate for the new technologies, a position she felt spectacularly unqualified for despite her central role in their development. But as she faced the assembled representatives of galactic civilization, she realized that her background as a mechanic might actually be an advantage. With respect, she replied to the Purist Coalition's arguments. "Consciousness is not some mystical, untouchable essence. It's a process like any other biological or technological process. And like any process, it can be understood, modified, and improved while still maintaining its essential function. She gestured to the holographic displays that surrounded them, showing the detailed technical specifications of the consciousness modification systems. When I repair a ship's hyperdrive, I don't destroy its ability to travel faster than light. I restore and sometimes enhance that ability by replacing damaged components and optimizing system configurations. What we're proposing is the same principle applied to consciousness itself. The debates continued for weeks, with representatives from across the galaxy arguing about the nature of consciousness, the ethics of modification, and the potential consequences of widespread adoption of the new technologies. But gradually, a consensus began to emerge around the principle that conscious beings should have the right to choose their own mental configuration, provided they could demonstrate genuine understanding of the implications, and the process remained reversible. The turning point came when the results of large-scale human trials began to be reported. Over 30,000 humans across dozens of worlds had volunteered to undergo the consciousness modification process, choosing from a range of configurations that included their original unmodified baseline, their current modified state, and several new options that enhance specific capabilities while preserving their essential human identity. The results exceeded even Sarah's most optimistic projections. Humans who chose to experience their unmodified consciousness reported breakthrough insights in art, science, and philosophy that had been impossible under their modified configurations. Those who opted for enhanced modifications demonstrated capabilities for interspecies cooperation and cosmic perspective that allowed them to solve problems that had challenged galactic civilization for generations. Most importantly, the psychological health and satisfaction scores for all participants improved significantly, regardless of which configuration they chose. Having conscious control over their mental state allowed humans to adapt their consciousness to match their current needs and circumstances rather than being locked into a single psychological configuration. The volunteer modification program has exceeded all expectations, reported Dr. Sarah Chun in her final presentation to the Galactic Congress, a body that had been hastily formed to oversee the implementation of consciousness modification technologies. Participants report enhanced life satisfaction, improved problem-solving capabilities, and stronger sense of personal autonomy. We've seen no cases of modification addiction or identity confusion, and the reversibility protocols have functioned perfectly in all instances. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the effect on interspecies relations. As more species began to implement their own voluntary modification programs, the barriers between radically different forms of consciousness began to break down. Beings who had been unable to communicate meaningfully for centuries discovered common ground through shared modification experiences. The Whisper folk, whose gaseous consciousness had made them nearly impossible for solid matter species to understand, developed modifications that allowed them to temporarily experience physical embodiment. In return, they shared modifications that allowed other species to experience the fluid, distributed awareness that was natural to their kind. The result was an explosion of cultural and scientific exchange that transformed galactic civilization in ways that no one had anticipated. Art forms emerged that combined the aesthetic sensibilities of dozens of species. Scientific research projects tackled problems from perspectives that incorporated radically different modes of consciousness. Diplomatic solutions were found for conflicts that had seemed irreconcilable when viewed from single-species perspectives. Sarah stood in the observation deck of the confluence, looking out at a galaxy that had been fundamentally transformed by technologies that grew out of her grandfather's original sacrifice. Ships from hundreds of species moved through local space, their crews working together with a level of cooperation that would have been impossible before the development of voluntary consciousness modification. "You did it," Ambassador Keth Moore said, his mental presence warm with approval and satisfaction. "You found a way to honor both the necessity that drove your grandfather's choice and the autonomy that choice temporarily sacrificed. Sarah nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful. We solved the immediate problem, but I keep thinking about what comes next. If consciousness is truly as malleable as we've discovered, what does that mean for the future of intelligence in the galaxy? The ambassador's crystalline features shifted in what she'd learned to recognize as a smile. That's a question for the next generation of consciousness researchers to answer. Your job was to prove that the technology could be developed ethically and implemented responsibly. What future generations choose to do with that technology is up to them. Through the observation deck's transparent walls, Sarah could see human ships working alongside vessels from dozens of other species, their crews enhanced by modifications that allowed them to experience the universe from perspectives their ancestors could never have imagined. It was a sight that filled her with both pride and humility. She had started this journey as a mechanic who fixed broken machines. She was ending it as someone who had helped fix something far more complex and important. The relationship between consciousness and choice in a universe filled with radically different forms of intelligence. The galaxy would continue to change and evolve, probably in ways that no one could predict. But now that change would be guided by conscious choice rather than hidden manipulation. Beings across the galaxy would have the freedom to determine their own mental configuration while retaining the ability to cooperate with others who had made different choices. It wasn't a perfect solution. No solution ever was. But it was a good solution, one that preserved both autonomy and cooperation while opening up possibilities for growth and development that had never existed before. Sarah smiled as she watched a transport ship dock with the Confluence, its cargo bay filled with consciousness researchers from across the galaxy who had come to study the new technologies and develop applications for their own species. The work would continue, the technology would improve, and galactic civilization would keep evolving. But now that evolution would be guided by choice rather than necessity, by transparency rather than secrecy, and by the recognition that consciousness itself was not something to be feared or constrained, but something to be understood, respected, and carefully nurtured as it reached toward possibilities that none of them could yet imagine. In the end, the mad old diplomat had been right to seek out a human mechanic. Sometimes the most complex problems really did require the simplest solutions. And sometimes the person best equipped to fix a broken system was someone who understood that every machine, no matter how complex, was just a collection of interconnected parts that could be understood, repaired, and improved by someone willing to get their hands dirty and do the work.